a 3 to 5 minute break in between the talk and the Q&A. Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the first Sheffield Philosophy Department seminar of spring 2021. It's great to see everyone in apparent good health and managing it through our third lockdown. Today we are extremely glad to welcome Professor Vanessa Wills from George Washington University in Washington, DC. Professor Wills specializes in moral and social and political philosophy and the philosophy of race, and also 19th century German philosophy. Without further ado, I hand over to Professor Wills.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm more or less going to get right into it, but I do want to just say a little bit about some of the background considerations of the talk that I'm about to give, which is based on the paper that you may have taken a look at. So my work is, by and large, or all right in some way, even when I'm not saying, Marxist theory or something. It's all sort of grounded in an engagement with Marx's thought, and in particular with this notion of the method of historical materialism, and attempting to offer analyses that, yes, are grounded in an awareness and an understanding and a detailing of the specific kind of material and economic circumstances. But beyond that, and I go into this more in other work, I think what really has to be emphasized about a historical materialist perspective is that it is production that is central to it. And we have to understand that not just in terms of the production line, right, and what goes on in factories, but the idea that everything about our human social existence is in fact a human product, right? That human life is a human product, and it's the sort of thing that we can look at various aspects of human social existence and see how they have emerged in the course of history at definite historical moments as a result of human activity, whether consciously or unconsciously. And that with that kind of perspective in view, we can also think about how we might intervene consciously using human activity to alter our circumstances, or to do away entirely, right, with certain aspects of our circumstances, right? And so when we talk, for example, about identity-based oppression, identities, including racial identities, are the sorts of things that are produced by human activity and are susceptible to being altered and changed and perhaps done away with. That, I think, is might be somewhat controversial, but most people will assent to some version of that claim. But I further, think that it is important to think about how a historical materialist perspective might help us to think about racism, right, and about identity-based oppressions, and how we might theorize how those things too, right, having arisen at a certain moment in history, and having developed over the course of history in response to other determining factors about human life, is also the sort of thing that might potentially be done away with, right, given other kinds of human behavior and human activity, and the assumption of a goal, right, of doing away with this kind of oppression. So the talk, it's called the white privilege concept in Marxism and critical race theory, and I want to say a bit about, why this problem, right? Why, if you're interested in thinking about a historical materialist approach to race and racism and doing away with race-based oppression, why focus specifically on this concept, and why focus specifically on these two theoretical traditions and the way that they interact with one another. So the white privilege concept, I guess I can say a little bit about my own. So this is not in the paper, right? A little bit about just my own kind of development, over the years as a socialist thinker, right? So within Marxist debates, right, within various kinds of Marxist and socialist spaces, there is a great deal of disagreement and controversy about how to think about the white privilege concept. And this is something that I raise in the paper, right? So I point out that in talking about a Marxist perspective and a critical race theory perspective, we also have to keep in mind that both of these traditions are quite heterogeneous. So that being said, I'll tell you a little bit about some of the controversies that arise around this concept of white privilege in the Marxist tradition, right? So there is a school of thought, right, that says we ought to abandon this term altogether. So in this paper, there's lots of folks who think this. In this paper, I select Mike Cole, who is a education theorist, as the sort of representative of this view, because he's written a great deal about it and has debated with Charles Mills in print about it, and so gives one kind of nice articulation of what a kind of Marxist class-based rejection of the white privilege concept would look like. And the argument there is a recognizably Marxist one. It's not I think it's wrong, but it's not a bad or terrible argument. So the argument is that the notion of white privilege, that when most people hear this concept, they understand it readily as suggesting that all white people, white working class people in particular, realize a benefit from racial oppression, in particular the oppression of Black people, but really the oppression of any non-white people, right? So the thought is, when you hear white privilege, that sounds like white people are benefiting from racism. And indeed, that is the way lots of folks who use the white privilege concept understand it. That is the way most folks working in the critical race theory tradition understand it, right? That this is something that white people gain over and above what they might have if racism were to be done away with. So that's tied to a number of other related claims, right? Like that white people then have a stake in racism, that white people, white workers in particular, then actually have a kind of material or psychological reason, right, to want racism to stay and to want it to continue forever and to oppose anti-racist efforts, right? So the kind of like the version of a Marxist approach that says let's abandon this concept says, look, the concept is just inextricably tied to a theory of race that is foreign to a Marxist analysis. And the reason that it's foreign to a Marxist analysis is the following. Marxists, right, and this is what I argue in the paper as well, Marxists generally do not think that white workers are in fact made better off by racism. Now, white elites might be, right? But in fact, white workers, right, generally speaking, are not better off on the basis of racism than they would be if racism didn't exist. And I'm going to go more into why a person might think this. This is one of the core claims of this paper. But for now, I'm just kind of, trying to present to you some of the background, right? Some of the kind of the not in a Hegelian sense, but just the kind of like the conversational background, right, out of which this paper arises. Now that's a common view that a lot of a number of Marxist theorists hold, but I think that it's mistaken, right? So I think that I simultaneously think that it is true that what we call white privilege more often harms most white people more than it helps them. And I think it's important to be clear about that. But I also think that honestly, I just think it's a little, I think the horse has left the barn, right? White privilege is the word is the concept that we use to describe this difference, right, between the kinds of outcomes that people of color have with respect to income, career prospects, health, and so on, and whites, right? And that it's a perfectly fine concept to describe this. And in fact, we talk about privileges in a number of different contexts. So if we were all, people who are in prison together are often assigned different privileges by the guards. And the point of the system of privileges is to divide the prisoners against one another so that they are easier to control. There's nothing analytically weird about, we talk like this all the time. So I think we should hold on to the concept and to the term. But as I said, I will argue for the plausibility of what will probably seem to most like the more surprising Marxist claim, which is that white workers don't benefit from racism directly. So now, in terms of, why think about Marxism and critical race theory together with respect to this question of white privilege? So one of the things that I have found surprising and puzzling is that in a way it is strange, right, that on the one hand that, as I said, in the critical race theory picture, white privilege benefits white people, white privilege gives all white people a stake in racism. This is, I quote a number of passages to this effect in the text, right, where this is the kind of language that's used, right? White people benefit, white people have a stake, white people would be going against their own interests if they were to try to do away with racism. That is the picture of white privilege we get from critical race theory. It's not the picture we get from Marxism. So these are two very different pictures, obviously. And what is puzzling in a way is that they have a very similar lineage. So both traditions are deriving their conception of white privilege from the work of W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction. But they then move in very different directions. So the question is, why is that? There's two questions, right? Why, right? What's going on that they both cite Du Bois as a kind of nodal point for this concept, but that they move in different directions and often and find themselves at loggerheads with one another. And two, can we fix this? Right? It seems as though if they are looking to similar kinds of lineages, then maybe there's a way to have a kind of detente. And again, right, so, I appeal to the heterogeneity, right, of these two traditions. Like, well, how heterogeneous are they, right? Are they elastic enough, that they can allow for some kind of agreement on this question? And I think the answer is yes. I think that despite the kind of hostilities that emerged between the two camps, I see no actual theoretical reason why they should be considered irreconcilable on this question. So, sorry, I'm scrolling because I want to draw you to the Du Bois quote. So in the paper, this comes sort of later in the text, but I want to sort of foreground it. So in Black Reconstruction, right, of course, Du Bois is talking about giving this, sort of richly detailed history of the United States in the years immediately following the Civil War. And it is a history of how Black people made and remade their lives during that time, but also it is an account of a lesser known period in American history, which has the name redemption. So Reconstruction is defeated by the organizing, right, of the aggrieved Southern white planter class that is very motivated to attempt as well as they can to reproduce the conditions of the antebellum South, right? That is that's their aim. That's where their money lies, right? So they're trying to reproduce those conditions. For a while, they are prevented from doing this by the use of federal U.S. troops that are basically preventing a sort of complete reign of terror, right? And so during this, there's a very short period where throughout the South, Black people have all sorts of rights that they didn't have during slavery, where Black people are holding office. And this is reversed, right? And so I think sometimes, certainly in the US, I think sometimes we think of the history of Black people's lives as a kind of like steady progress, maybe less so in the last few years, we're likely to think about it this way. But it's important to think about how, you have chattel slavery, you have the Civil War, you have this very brief moment, of kind of the possibility of real democracy flourishing in the United States, and that is quickly quashed, right, nipped in the bud by a reign of actual terror, right, of violence and murders. And Jim Crow law figures into this, right? So Jim Crow laws are instituted as a way of reversing the gains, right, that have been made by Black people in the Reconstruction period. So Du Bois in Black Reconstruction, he writes about the role of white identity in breaking working class solidarity between newly freed Black workers and poor whites, and enforcing in its place a new kind of solidarity based on racial identity, right? Of the solidarity of poor and working whites with elite whites. And so here's what Du Bois says. So he argues, he uses this phrase of a public and psychological wage, right? Now, oftentimes, especially in some of the critical race theory expressions of this, right? And we see it in Cheryl Harris's Whiteness is Property, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment. What we most commonly hear white privilege described as is a psychological wage, that it is this predominantly kind of mental, subjective feeling of superiority that white workers have, which is so valuable to them that they would rather maintain this psychological benefit of whiteness than to feed their kids, I guess, right? But in Du Bois, it's a public and psychological wage, and the public bit matters, right? So he argues that a public and psychological wage was paid to European descended workers as an inducement for those workers to identify with European descended capitalists on the basis of race, rather than with Black workers on the basis of shared economic interest. The implementation of this wage, right, allowed the white bourgeoisie to break working class solidarity in the South. And Du Bois writes that white-Black class unity among workers failed to work in the South because, and here's the quote, he says, the theory of race was supplemented by a carefully planned and slowly evolved method, which drove such a wedge between the white and Black workers that there probably are not today in the world two groups of workers with practically identical interests who hate and fear each other so deeply and persistently, and who are kept so far apart that neither sees anything of common interest. So I think it's important to highlight here, right, that here Du Bois is drawing together both ideal and material factors, right? So we have the theory of race, this ideology of race, right, and what he describes as a carefully planned method, right? So then the question is, what is the method? And Du Bois goes on to write, the white group of laborers were admitted freely with all classes of white people to public functions, public parks, and the best schools. The police were drawn from their ranks, and the courts, dependent upon their votes, treated them with such leniency as to encourage lawlessness. White schoolhouses were the best in the community and conspicuously placed. They cost anywhere from 2 to 10 times as much per capita as the colored schools. The newspapers specialized on news that flattered the poor whites and almost utterly ignored the Negro, except in crime and ridicule, end quote. So I think it's important here, right, to notice the role of power and of class. And that power that is being implemented here in order to put this method into effect is class power, right? So the agent doing the admitting, hiring, exonerating, budgeting, and flattering, it's not, you know, whiteness as some kind of spectral agent, right? And it's not poor and working class white people themselves. White privilege, on Du Bois's analysis, is the creation of the ruling Southern white capitalist class, a system implemented through its control of the major institutions of Southern public life, right? Like control over the police, over schooling, over the newspapers, right? And so on. So, okay, so that's what we see in Du Bois. And I want to turn to thinking about how we see the theory of, or the concept rather, of white privilege appear in critical race theory. So, as I say, you know, critical race theory is quite multivocal, right? But one of the most impactful discussions of white privilege to influence, right, much of the critical race theory literature is Cheryl Harris's account in her article "Whiteness is Property." So this is it's a foundational document, right, in the development of CRT's analysis of white privilege, and it's the locus classicus of much contemporary thought on the subject. So one thing that's interesting here, right, and we see it right away, of course, from the title. Harris's account of white privilege is, of course, very, very, very far from being totally divorced from an account of private property, right, or of class. So these things actually do play a role in her analysis. So she argues that the way to think of whiteness is to think of it as a kind of private property to which one either has or lacks legal title. She calls it a master key that unlocks the golden door of opportunity. So here's what she says about white identity, right? So she says, owning white identity as property affirmed the self-identity and liberty of whites, and conversely denied the self-identity and liberty of blacks. The economic coercion of white supremacy on self-definition nullifies any suggestion that passing, racial passing, is a logical exercise of liberty or self-identity. The fact of race subordination was coercive, and it circumscribed the liberty to define oneself. Self-determination of identity was not a right for all people, but a privilege accorded on the basis of race, right? And this is a fairly common kind of framing that we see, right, where whiteness and white identity is understood primarily as a site of freedom, right, a kind of a site of agency and individual choice, right? So on Harris's view, a person with legal title to white racial identity experiences her identity as a site of freedom, citizenship, and expanded possibilities. It is, at least vis-a-vis non-white identity, an expanded agency to move in and act upon the world. And this claim is in certain ways reminiscent of Peggy McIntosh's observation that freedom of confident action is frequently reserved as a white advantage in a white supremacist society. So I want to say a bit, though, about what the reference to racial passing, right, how that figures into Harris's account, because I think the paper is great. I disagree with it, but there are some really sort of subtle and rich observations that Harris makes here. So Harris tells in brief the story of a family relative who passed as white, right? So this is a person who was very fair-skinned and was able to, in certain contexts, most importantly in an employment context, was able to carry herself in a way that she could be assumed to be white, right? And Harris's argument is that the decision to pass, right, the decision of a Black person in an anti-Black white supremacist society, the decision to pass has to be understood as a constrained choice, right? It is something that person is doing under duress, right? Because the price of choosing not to do it is to lack access to various important material goods, right, that are necessary in order to survive and keep one's family alive. And I think that I think that's quite plausible, right? Extremely plausible and valuable to think about in this way. However, right, so the contrast is supposed to be with whiteness, right, where whiteness is this site of self-identity, freedom to self-identify, right, freedom to construct one's own identity according to one's own plans and desires for oneself. And I wonder whether that can be maintained, right? Because if it's true that identifying as white in a white supremacist society is a necessary precondition for having access to these various kinds of material goods, then it suggests that for white people as well, there's quite a cost, right, to failing to perform white identity, right, in the right ways. It means that we have to think about, well, how are these costs imposed, right? What is creating this system of costs and benefits? And for that, I think we have to look beyond whiteness and white identity itself. And this is the place where where Harris's argument does not go, right? For Harris, it is whiteness, right, that is creating, right, this system of advantage and disadvantage. So let's see, I have about 15. How long do I have? Sorry, I lost track.
You've got another. We started at. You've had 30 minutes, and you can have up to an hour. So you've really got to.
Oh, okay. It said 40 in the. Okay, great. Well, I won't go for an hour, but
up to an hour. Yeah. Sort of the target.
Okay.
Up to an hour is like the maximum permissible.
Okay, super. Yeah. Well, okay. So I promise I won't go that long, but I'll go for about 10 or 15 minutes. So, okay. So I think that the sort of appeal to the self-making and the self-identity and the free agency of whiteness can't explain, right, why it is that well, first of all, one of the things I say in the paper is, if it's true that whiteness operates as this kind of site of complete, freedom, self-making, and self-identity, why did white workers set their sights so low? White workers in the United States are doing horribly, right? Why settle for slightly less dilapidated schoolrooms, ever so slightly higher wages? So in the United States, there is the opposite of what you would expect if white privilege were the sort of thing that realized a material benefit. So in the parts of the United States where you see the largest discrepancy between Black wages and white wages, you also see that the wages of the entire working class are lower. And if it were true, right, that there is a direct benefit to white workers that they get from being, as much superior to Blacks as possible, this is one of the things that would be sort of surprising to find. You would think the bigger the disparity, you would expect to see a link, right, between a large disparity and whites doing better, whites getting whatever it is that Blacks aren't. But that's not actually what we see. One of the things that I talk about in the course of researching this paper, I wanted to know, well, for obvious reasons, I was like, well, I have to learn more about Jim Crow laws, right, and how these function in the South. And one of the questions that I had was I wanted to know how many white people were disfranchised by Jim Crow laws, because the way that Jim Crow laws were written was oftentimes designed to be race blind, right, in a way that critical race theory, I think, helps us to understand, right, the way that a law can appear race neutral but have this outsized kind of racial effect, right? And so the laws would be written in ways that said, well, you're only allowed to vote if you have this amount of property. You're only allowed to vote if you can pay this tax. You're only allowed to vote if you can pass this test. And, of course, these laws were designed to disfranchise Blacks, but it occurred to me like there had to be a lot of very sort of downtrodden whites who also were not benefiting, right, from these laws. And that's what led me to, this is an argument that occurs in the paper, if you have a chance to read it perhaps after this, but to work that is presented in a book by Frederick Ogden called The Poll Tax in the South. And one of the things that is striking about this book, I found things that I did not expect to find. I thought that there would be lots of whites who were disfranchised as a kind of tolerable side effect of attacking Blacks. But there's cases where the actual explicit goal was to disfranchise poor whites who were voting for parties that the elite Southern white planter class disapproved of. So the disfranchisement of poor white voters was so one of the things that Ogden collects is transcripts of meetings of politicians in the South, right, in the Jim Crow South. And these were Democratic Party leaders at that time. Of course, the Democratic Party is the party of Southern, white slavers. And they were very concerned about increasing numbers of both Black and poor white voters who are attracted to populism, kind of like left-wing version of populism. So the disfranchisement of poor white voters was indeed frequently stated behind closed doors as the explicit goal of the poll taxes. Although in public, conservative Democrats would say, well, this is, white supremacy, join us, we're white like you, right? So in Virginia, for example, there's a case of, in a transcript of one of these meetings deciding how to hold on to political power, you have a convention delegate saying, I am in favor, Mr. Chairman, of the capitation tax because I believe it will disqualify some white men in Virginia who ought to be disqualified. The Alabama Governor William Oates, he justified the poll taxes with the claim, there are white men who have no more right and no more business to vote than a Negro, and not as much as some of them. Which is interesting, by the way, because that is, whatever, it's horribly racist, of course. But it's interesting because it is in its particular flavor of horrible racism. It actually denies one of the central tenets of white supremacy, which is that any white person is superior to any Black person, right? And so it's interesting to see the ways, sometimes I think when the argument is made, hey, like this is a plot by elite whites to trick people, right? It sounds like a conspiracy theory. And so it is interesting to sort of like see the text where they're saying, we are going to use this logic of white supremacy to keep some of these poor whites away from the polls who are threatening our class power. So, I'm going to conclude by saying a bit about why I think there is what I call room for accord, right, between Marxism and critical race theory on white privilege. So so as I mentioned earlier, right? There's a discussion in print between Charles Mills and Mike Cole. And Mills writes the following, right? He says, this is the reason why at this point there is not room for accord, right? So he says, Europe, this is Charles Mills. Europeans, and European settler states dominate the planet, privileging whites globally, and racial self and other identification has been central to the social psychology of the world over the past few hundred years, tending to trump, contra orthodox Marxism, other identities in times of conflict. Can a modified historical materialism that takes race seriously, instead of seeing it as merely epiphenomenal to class, explain this fact? I would like to think so, but the point is that it does have to be a theoretically revised one. And I readily agree that if we have a theory that sees race as purely epiphenomenal to class, that is going to be highly unequal to the task of theorizing the relationship between race and class. Racial ideology, like any other set of ideas, plays an enormous role in determining the material and economic circumstances of the world, right? People act on the basis of ideology, and they act on the world that they are a part of. So it would be, if that's the view, if the view is epiphenomenalism, then obviously everyone should reject it, and the quote unquote orthodox Marxists should go home because they have nothing to say. But that's not the Marxist conception of anything, right? Much less of the relationship between race and class, right? It is not a kind of simplistic, one-sided materialism. The Marxist view is that there is a dynamic interaction, right, between matter and ideas, but that if we want to understand what ideas are emerging at a particular moment in time, why certain ideas have hegemony, and how it is that we can do away with certain ideas, that we have to attend centrally, right, to those materialist questions about who has power, right, and what is in the interests of those who have power, and how those who are currently denied access to political power can intervene in order to transform their circumstances. And I think an example of how this can be done is, ironically enough, right, found in Du Bois himself, who is looked to by both kinds of areas, right, of this discourse as a kind of a figure who serves as an origin, right, of the concept of white privilege itself. Du Bois himself, of course, interested in Marxism, to say the least, for much of his life, died a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, and shortly before writing Black Reconstruction, argued that in order for Black people to understand their situation in the United States, they would have to make a close study of Marxism, right, and what Marxism has to say about the role of class. So he says, American Negroes must, he writes this in March 1933, 2 years before Black Reconstruction, American Negroes must understand what Marx's panacea was for the working class in England, France, and Germany if they would see their way clearly in the future. So I think Du Bois himself, right, offers resources for thinking through what it would be to have a kind of reconciliation of the most clarifying insights that we get from both Marxist and critical race theory traditions. So I'll end there and am excited for Q&A. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. So I think we'll take. Wait, suddenly you've disappeared from my screen.
Oh, I'm here.
Yeah, good, great. Okay, the thing where it, like, switches to whoever's speaking and like, moving, and it's like, that person must be speaking. Would you like to take 5 minutes? Is that fine for you?
Oh, like a little breather? Sure.
Yeah, we normally take a break now.
That sounds great.
Great. Let's reconvene at 3:25 for the Q&A. And
Perfect.
thank you